Okey-dokey. So I have graded the research papers, as you may have seen. Overall, you guys did a pretty good job. I know research papers are not easy to write, so I appreciate the work you guys put into them. So if you have any questions about the feedback, just let me know, but you should be able to see your grades. All right. We're going to finish chapter 16. We're going to talk about monetary policies, investments, taxes. So basically the other half of the equation when we're talking about the economy. Okay, so monetary economic policy is the regulation of the economy by manipulating the available supply of money and credit. If credit is too easily available, that's a problem. If there's not enough credit, that's also a problem. So we got to make sure there's enough, but how much is too much? That's a little tricky. So a lot of the monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, as it's also called. The Fed is 12 Federal Reserve banks that exist in major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and so on. And the Federal Reserve banks are banks for other banks and bankers. So the Fed banks don't loan to consumers. They exist to give loans to banks as necessary. They're also in charge of the currency and coin supply. So I'm sure you've all seen the signs that say we're experiencing a coin shortage. Because people aren't spending money as much, coins aren't circulating like they regularly do. So banks and convenience stores are running out of coins. So that's why they're asking people to either pay with exact change or use their debit or credit card, because we do have a coin shortage. It's very hard to get your hands on nickels, dimes, and quarters, especially. The Federal Reserve Board is a 7-member board. The members of this board cannot be fired during their term other than for just cause. And the chair of the Fed is elected by the president, and they get a 4-year term. And they are not beholden to the president. The president can make recommendations, but he can't force the board to comply. So the Fed controls the interest rates, tries to handle inflation, and buys and sells various government securities. So they will sometimes lower interest rates to stimulate demand, or raise interest rates to control the amount of loaning going on. So again, the president can make a recommendation, but he can't force the federal board to raise or lower interest rates, which can be frustrating for a president who may want them to take action because he can't make them. I know I've asked this before, but have any of you taken an economics class? No? You have? Okay. So some of this is familiar? Okay. Yeah, if you do end up taking an econ class, a lot of this you'll go back over. And if you want some real fun, take an international political economy class. That's easy. Okay. Our bank accounts are protected by the FDIC, the Federal Depositors Insurance, I'm going to say company or corporation, one or the other. The FDIC exists because of the Great Depression. Banks were essentially using deposits to engage in the stock market. So when the stock market crashed, people's entire savings were wiped out. So the FDIC insured bank deposits up to $250,000. So if your local bank branch closes, your money is still protected. If the bank collapses, you still have your money. It's a way of protecting us from when banks go and do something stupid, as they so often do. There's also the role of the Housing and Urban Development Cabinet Department that helps to ensure home mortgages, encourages banks to lower interest rates, and can help provide loans for special groups like veterans who may be eligible for special loans. They also intervened when the economy collapsed in 2008. Mortgage REITs failed and then banks failed. So Bear Stearns, which was a Wall Street investment bank, was going into bankruptcy and thousands of people were going to be laid off. So the Fed arranged for JP Morgan Chase to buy out the company so that it wouldn't go under, the banking industry wouldn't collapse, and people would still have jobs. So they'll sometimes do that. They'll arrange for a company to be bought out to prevent a collapse in the industry. But there were mortgage companies that went out of business. Fannie and Freddie Mac no longer exist. They were completely wiped out by the collapse of the housing market in 2008. And over time, the Fed has provided $1.5 trillion in emergency loans, mostly during recessions like 2008. So banks would still provide student loans, car loans, and housing loans. When the housing market collapsed in 2008, it became a buyer's market. Basically, you could take your time looking for a house. You had literally hundreds of options depending on where you were living. So they wanted people to still continue to buy houses. So they were trying to encourage banks to continue to give out mortgages just more safely than they were. Because people stopped buying houses out of fear, but people still got to be able to sell their house. So it was a lot easier to buy a house than it was to sell a house. So they're trying to encourage people to buy houses to prevent more and more foreclosures. All right, taxes, the big kahuna. Originally, The federal government relied on taxes on the sale of things like alcohol, tobacco, tea, things that people would buy every day, regular purchases. And it wasn't until 1913, with the 16th Amendment, that we got the federal income tax. So a national income tax has only existed for 107 years. Prior to that, it was largely property tax and then taxes on goods. And there's two types of taxes that we tend to see: progressive and regressive. A progressive tax is one in which the rate of taxation goes up as your income goes up. So the income tax is progressive. The more money you make, the more taxes you pay up to a certain percentage. A regressive tax, on the other hand, is essentially a flat tax. And it's a tax that hits lower income individuals harder because they're paying a higher percentage of their income on this tax. So sales tax is regressive. Here in Texas, sales tax is 8.25%. If you're making $15,000 a year, that's a lot to pay in taxes. If you're making $50,000, it's not going to hit you as hard. So the sales tax is regressive, as are Social Security taxes and gasoline taxes, because you're losing that money to taxes. So it hits lower income Americans harder. We've also seen a significant decrease in taxes on the wealthy. Up until about the 1960s, the wealthiest Americans paid 91% in income tax. Now they pay not much more than 37–38%. We've also seen businesses being able to use loopholes like having money going into offshore bank accounts or taking business losses on purpose so they don't have to pay as much in taxes. So the amount of taxable income has gone down. And we've seen arguments over how effective tax cuts actually are. Republicans like to pass tax cuts on the wealthy. Democrats tend to favor tax cuts on middle and low-income Americans. Republicans argue that cutting taxes for the wealthy stimulates the economy. Democrats argue that if you give lower-income Americans more money, then they go out and spend it. But any way you look at it, tax cuts do significantly increase the size of the federal deficit. They are very, very expensive for the economy. All right, so obviously there's not unlimited amounts of money that can be spent on the federal budget. So there's a couple of different agencies who are involved in the process. The Office of Management and Budget is part of the executive branch. And so they help to put together the president's budget. How much money does he want each cabinet agency to get? Where does he want to focus on spending or cutting spending? So they put together proposed budget from the executive branch. In the legislative branch, you have the Congressional Budget Office that helps to create the annual budget resolution to set the spending. Every year, Congress has to pass a national budget. If Congress does not pass a budget, then the government shuts down. So when we've seen the government shut down, it's because there's disagreements within Congress or disagreements between Congress and the president. So at the end of 2018, the government shut down because President Trump wanted more money for the border wall in the budget. Democrats in Congress said no. Both sides refused to compromise, and we have a government shutdown. So this budget resolution is critical to keeping the government open. So they have to find a way to get this budget passed. But there are problems relating to the fact that the government is spending more money than it is taking in. So then we get the arguments between Democrats and Republicans over how do we reduce the deficit. Republicans will say cut spending in welfare, education, healthcare. Democrats will say increase taxes for corporations and the wealthy. So they go back and forth on what takes priority, budget cuts or increased taxes. And it does not help that there are mandatory spending programs where you cannot touch them in the regular budget process. So even if Republicans want to spend money or cut money, they cannot cut it from Social Security, Medicare, or unemployment benefits. Those are basically keep your hands off of them programs. Social Security and Medicare are the two most expensive entitlement programs, but Congress cannot touch them. And if they wanted to try to cut spending, there'd be a whole lot of very angry senior citizens writing their Congress members, and they are not going to pick them off. Okay. The government also, of course, tries to regulate the economy. Antitrust policy is where the government will not allow monopolies to exist. Microsoft was almost dissolved in the mid-90s because they were buying up all the smaller IT companies and taking over control of the market. So they had to back off of that a little bit. It's why Amazon can't just buy Walmart outright. It's why Sprint can't just buy out AT&T. You need competition. The fewer choices consumers have, the worse it's going to get. So they tried to prevent these companies from taking over entire sections of industry. We need to have multiple phone companies, cable providers, IT services. So the government will try to prevent some company from dominating the industry. They can also require companies to make their accounting and business activities publicly available. This is especially important when it comes to things like investing in the stock market. You need to know how the company is doing. When Chipotle has an outbreak of E. coli, people tend to dump their stock, right? You don't want to be investing in a bad company. But recently it was announced that Pfizer is at about 92% effectiveness for their COVID vaccine. So their stock is trading up. People are buying into Pfizer stock because they want to be on the ground floor if they are the ones who create the COVID vaccine. And there's another company that's sitting at about 94, 95% effectiveness. So people are going to invest in certain industries. And we want to make sure people know that the accounting and activities are reliable, genuine, that they're not trying to fake people out. There's also, of course, agencies like the Food and Drug Administration to make sure we're not eating food that's laced with E. coli or all sorts of other unpleasant things, and that our prescription drugs are safe. We don't want to be taking medication that causes us to murder our roommates in their sleep or something, even if they snore. We also have protections in terms of things like workplace safety. OSHA exists to make sure the odds of getting injured are very low. No job is 100% risk-free. We don't need people falling 50 stories off a construction site if that's preventable. We don't need people slipping and falling and getting internal bleeding in their brain because nobody puts up a wet floor sign or something. Also, consumer product safety, making sure we don't get shocked every time we plug in our hair dryer or something like that. And protections for the environment. So the government does try to make sure our food, water, prescriptions, and workplaces are generally safe. Now, there have been some attempts at deregulation. The current administration hasn't been enforcing the Clean Air and Water Act as much as usual. And very recently, they've been trying to hurry through permits to drill in the Arctic Wildlife Preserve for oil. So there's been some deregulation, although usually that's only done if the company can prove that they don't need oversight. The government also provides subsidies and contracting to various companies. Subsidies can be a grant of cash or land to an individual or company. In the 19th century, the government basically gave the railroads huge amounts of land to create the national railway system. Money to help people get involved in agriculture. The federal government still provides subsidies for farmers, which are important if there's a bad crop. If there's a drought in the Midwest, we need to make sure farmers can still survive to the next season. There's also usually tax breaks for companies that set up a new business somewhere, hire certain workers, are working on new technology. So corporate subsidies cost the government about $100 billion a year. They are expensive. Some of them are necessary, some of them, it depends. So the federal government is also able to contract out to private companies, like prisons. We're seeing more and more private prison systems being built. It's cheaper because then the state doesn't have to pay for it. They can just have this company come in and build the new prison. The downside to that is there's less regulations of private prisons, and they can sometimes not be very well run. We also tend to see a lot of defense contracting. Huge amounts of money being poured into things like body armor, military equipment, bulletproof vests, and so on. Companies like Blackwater and Halliburton getting involved in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, sending private contractors to serve alongside the military. And President Eisenhower was concerned about this. He didn't want there to be this huge military-industrial complex. So there was a huge amount of military spending up through the Cold War. It declined in the 1990s, and then of course after 9/11 there was a huge spike in defense spending. Defense makes up the majority of our national budget. We spend more on our military than the next 15 countries combined. Partly because of our obligations to organizations like NATO and the United Nations, but we do spend a fair amount of money on defense. And it is harder to keep an eye on defense contractors if they do stupid crap while they're abroad. Like the people in Iraq who were basically stealing antiques and shipping them back to the United States. And there's also the role of the environment in terms of the economy. We did have the passage of the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts in the early 1970s. And this was partly because of the huge amounts of industrial pollution in the water. I'm going to step away from the slide for a second so I can show you kind of what we're talking about here. This is what Cleveland's river looked like in the 1960s. Anyone want to take a swim in that? It actually caught fire in 1969 because of all the industrial waste that was being dumped into the river. Yeah, that looks tasty, doesn't it? So, obviously, you do not want that in the water. So now the water is actually drinkable. Now the people in Cleveland can actually drink the water. Huzzah. We also had the first Earth Day in 1970. But now we're facing issues about climate change. As a country, we are responsible for 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. despite the fact that we only make up 10% of the global population. 72% of Americans do believe the world is warming, but less than half of us believe it's because of humans. So we've got this debate about climate change. You've got scientists who say it's real and we're reaching a critical threshold, and then we've got politicians who say it's a load of crap. There's also the very legitimate concern about environmental changes in the economy. It can be expensive to switch to alternative energy, to build cars that have fewer emissions. So the trade-off would be having to spend more money to cut down on our carbon footprint. And there's been some reluctance by the political leaders to actually do that. The Environmental Protection Agency wants fuel standards on cars to be set at an average of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. That's probably not going to happen. And while it would be very nice to have the majority of cars be that fuel efficient, the problem is getting consumers to pay for it, because it is still relatively expensive to buy a hybrid or very high fuel efficient car. So we'd have to find a way to lower the cost so that consumers would be willing to buy more fuel efficient vehicles and get rid of the damn Hummer, but that's a whole different story. There's also, of course, concerns about adapting to environmental changes. This has been one of the most active hurricane seasons on record. We've already gone through the names that are given to hurricanes, and now we're on Hurricane Iota that just hit Central America as a Category 4 hurricane. We're supposed to be hitting the end of hurricane season, but it has been brutal, and it may only get worse. It's estimated within the next 100 years, countries like Bangladesh will be half underwater. So there's a problem, we just haven't quite figured out what we want to do about it. And then there's the standard concerns about how do we pay for alternative energies. Solar panels on roofs are expensive, so how do we get consumers to agree to do this? How do we switch away from using oil as our primary source of energy? There's been the suggestion that we should increase gas taxes, so gas is about $5 a gallon, but that doesn't actually help low-income Americans because they still have to be able to get to work, so that's not a very reasonable suggestion. They can't afford to pay that much. So we know there's a problem, we just can't quite agree on what to do about it. All right, so what's the future of our economy? Well, part of the problem we have is the hyper-partisanship in Washington, D.C. Democrats and Republicans are not willing to sit down and really discuss what changes are necessary to fix the economy. They're locked into these ideological opposites, and we don't see a bipartisan cooperation. And over time, we have become a very globally connected economy. We are very dependent on China for trade, manufacturing, and so on. And this global connection is both good and bad. It's good because we can buy and sell goods all over the world. You can buy something from Australia and it doesn't take terribly long to get here. The downside is that we can't really go after China for some of its policies when they make most of our products. So we're dependent on other countries, but they're also dependent on us. So we're very globally connected to other countries. We are also unfortunately seeing a rise in the income gap. The middle class is shrinking, and the 1% is getting increasingly wealthy. We have the largest income gap of any developed nation in the world. So that's not a good sign. It's not a good sign that our middle class is shrinking. And so if you ask people, the majority of Americans say, yeah, our economy doesn't work. We got to find a way to fix it. But they don't agree on what to do about it. Some argue that we just need to stop spending so much money. Some argue we need to re-up taxes. So we know there's a problem. We just can't quite agree on where and how to fix the problem. And we are seeing more and more economic policy at the state and the local level. Property taxes are controlled by state and local governments. Sales taxes are controlled by the state and local government. We're seeing states handling the responsibilities for education, healthcare, and so on. So more and more the state and local government is being asked to handle certain policies, and we're seeing less hand-holding and less regulation by the federal government. More of a hands-off approach, unless they need to step in. Alright, so I want to show you two different charts. I know they're kind of hard to read, but this is the decrease in income tax rates over time. Between 1950 and about the late 1960s, the wealthiest Americans paid 91% in income tax. Yeah. Today, they pay about 35%. We're talking an almost 60% decrease in taxes over the last 50 years. Corporations used to be taxed at about 52%. Now it's maybe 35% if they're actually paying the taxes and not using various loopholes and techniques to get out of it. Okay, so we've gone from 91% to 35%, and 52% to 35%. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that the burden of taxes is placed on the lower income Americans. If you're about here, which is 40 to 85,000, which is where most Americans tend to be, you're paying 22% in taxes. But if you're making $500,000 or more, you're only paying 37%. So even though you're making roughly 10 times what someone else is making, you're only paying 15% more in taxes. So the burden is placed on lower income Americans. So most people will pay between 22 to 24% in income tax every year, versus the very wealthy who only pay 37%. And by the way, this 37% applies to Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, the Walmart family, and Warren Buffett. All right, so billionaires are not paying more than 37%. It's why Jeff Bezos is on track to become the first individual to be a trillionaire. Yeah, he's worth more than a lot of countries, even after his divorce. So let me ask you this. Does that seem fair? No. What about you guys online? Does this tax system seem fair to you? Yes, kind of. Okay. All right. I'm not saying we go back to taxing people 91% because that's a lot, right? That's a lot of money to be taken from people. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say if you're making $2 million or more a year that a 50% tax rate would be reasonable. That seems reasonable, at least 50%-ish, give or take. Okay. Yeah. The problem is, I mean, that's a pretty significant chunk of money to be paying when you're not actually making that much money. And it becomes even more problematic in states where you have to pay not only a federal income tax, but a state income tax. Texas is one of a handful of states that doesn't have a state income tax. When I lived in Massachusetts, I would get taxed federal income tax, Massachusetts state income tax, federal Social Security and Medicare, state Social Security and Medicare. So you get taxed twice, which means at the end of every year, you have to pay, or you have to file two different sets of tax returns, federal and state. So you lose more money up front in those states. The plus side for the states that have a state income tax is they do have more money. They do have more money, and the sales and property taxes tend to be lower because you're paying the state income tax. Whereas here in Texas, our property taxes and sales taxes are higher because we don't have a state income tax. It's a lot of tax for the other states. Yeah, it is. It is. It's a lot of tax. And here's the thing. I do not begrudge people like Jeff Bezos and others for becoming wealthy. But they didn't do it on their own. I mean, we did help them. We paid taxes that helped them get their business up and running. The reason Jeff Bezos is an almost trillionaire is because of consumers like us buying from Amazon. If we all of a sudden decided none of us are buying a damn thing from Amazon, that company would be in serious trouble, right? So if we help them get off the ground, why shouldn't they pay back for that? You know, if we help them get up and running, why shouldn't they pay us back for that? And there are some millionaires like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett who have actually come out and said, we're not paying our fair share in taxes. We want you to actually increase our taxes. So there are some millionaires and billionaires who are just like, clearly this is not the way the system was designed. Because they are good people. Yeah, there are some really good billionaires out there. There's some not so great ones, but there's some decent ones. How many of you have heard about Biden's new tax plan? How many of you have heard that your taxes are going to go up, or someone's commented that they think your taxes are going to go up? Yeah, okay. Mine is not on 4. Yeah, yeah. And you're absolutely right, Eileen, because when economists have looked at his plan, they have said that the majority of Americans will not see a tax increase. I don't think anyone in this room is making $400,000 a year. If you are, good for you. But most of us are not going to make that. We probably won't even make $400,000, well, maybe over our lifetime, but definitely not a year. Okay, so they're extremely wealthy and they're mad. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I understand it. Nobody likes paying taxes, but they're a necessary evil. If we want healthcare, if we want reasonable education costs, the money has to come from somewhere. So liberal and conservative think tanks have all said that the majority of Americans will not see a tax increase. So at least that we have going for us. We're also quite different compared to the rest of the world. Throughout most of Europe, the majority of people pay about a 50% income tax. Now the trade-off is you pay up front and then you benefit later. So in countries like Denmark, the cost of education is maybe $2,000 or $3,000 a year. Healthcare is universal, so you don't have to pay for doctor's visits. So it's a trade-off. Here, we don't pay the taxes, but we have to pay for school and healthcare. Throughout most of Europe, they pay in taxes, but then they benefit from low-cost healthcare and education. So one way or another, we have to pay for it. And the question is just, do we pay for it through taxes, or do we pay for it for health insurance, co-pays, etc.? So one way or the other, we have to pay. It's just a matter of which way we're going to do it. So let me just say this. Trying to predict the economy is about as successful as going to a psychic. No disrespect to psychics, but honestly, you're not going to get a very solid prediction. At the end of last year, we were predicted to have a very strong economy. Obviously, no one expected a global pandemic. So most economists right now aren't really trying to make any predictions for a year from now, because even with a vaccine, it's still going to be a while before people can really go out and about. Businesses can open at full capacity. And honestly, I think we're still going to be wearing masks about a year from now. It's going to be a while still before we get over this, even if a vaccine is released early next year. So the economy is one of those extremely difficult to predict kind of factors. And so it's unfortunate when we tend to blame the president for the economy when really it's so many different factors that come into play that you just can't necessarily predict. There's only so much the government can do to control the economy. So it's just basically a hot mess, and all we can do is just hope it doesn't go sideways. Okay. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah. Any of you want to become econ majors now? We're going to start talking about social policy on Thursday. So read the first half of chapter 17. As I've said, I have graded your research papers. So if you do have a question about your grade, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. Social policy is a little less wonky, so that should be fun. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all on